In the early hours of the morning, long before sunrise, temple guards came to arrest Jesus. They bound his hands and his feet and led him in the dark across the Kidron Valley. They passed tombs of the ancient priests and the gates where the book of Ezekiel says the Messiah will one day place his feet. Then they walked past the temple. Far above them loomed the pinnacle where Jesus had once been tempted by evil. If you really are the Son of God, if you're the Messiah, just throw yourself down. Surely the Lord will send angels to protect you. The evil voice whispered, but Jesus knew better than to test the Lord. He resisted Satan's schemes and withstood every test. But his greatest challenge was still to come. The guards led Jesus through the valley. Then they began to push and pull him up the hill of Zion. Step by step, they climbed the long staircase that led from the lower part of the city to the upper part. It probably only took about 20 minutes to make that mile-long journey from the Garden of Gethsemane. But it seemed like years. Each step took Jesus closer and closer to Caiaphas. Once Jesus was in custody, the Sanhedrin was assembled hastily in the grand hall of the home of the high priest. Nearby was the pit, a cold stone cistern made a convenient jail cell. Many a troublemaker had been held in that pit, and now it was the Lord's turn. Guards lowered Jesus into the darkness through a hole in the ceiling. Peter watched from the shadows. Even though he had fled earlier, he managed to muster up enough courage to follow Jesus and the guards after they left Gethsemane. But he was careful not to get too close. When the regiment reached the courtyard of the high priest's home, Peter slipped in amongst the guards while they warmed themselves by the fire. From that vantage point, he could see and hear just about everything. But it was a risk. If the guards recognized him, Peter could be thrown into that pit with Jesus. But he just had to know what was happening. He just had to be there. The trial began almost immediately. The Sanhedrin was a council made up of 71 elders who were considered the wisest and the most pious men of the time. They had devoted themselves to God. And Caiaphas, the high priest, was the greatest religious figure of our time. Together, these men ruled over the religious affairs of the Jewish people, while the Romans ruled over our political affairs. So the Sanhedrin controlled the temple and the religious courts. Now, normally, the Sanhedrin met during the day in the temple courts, and they never met during religious feasts. But nothing about this day had been normal. Jesus had become very popular with the people. They were impressed by his teaching and sensed the power of God at work in him. Just a few days ago, the streets had been crowded with people who welcomed Jesus like a king. But this frightened the priests and the elders. Jesus' teachings did not line up with their way of thinking. If more and more people decided to follow Jesus, what would happen to them? What would happen to the priests and the elders? And what would happen to our people? The priests and elders whispered among themselves, if folks continue to flock to Jesus, the Romans are going to get wind of this, and who knows what Caesar might do. This could cause trouble for the entire nation. It'll certainly be bad for us. And that's when they hatched their evil plan. It would be better for one man to die than for all of us to suffer, they reasoned. So, Jesus must die. But they had to work quickly and quietly to avoid a riot. It was hard to imagine. It was hard to imagine that our priests and elders, the holy ones, could do something so treacherous, so wrong, so evil. But the sad truth is that they could not see what was right in front of them. The great God of the universe was here, right here, walking around in human flesh, looking for all the world like a teacher, a healer, a poor working man. And he was sitting right now in that pit, all because the ones who said they served God could not see God. They could not see God in Jesus. They were so blinded by their love of power and their fear of losing it that they could not see the Holy One right there in their midst. So our religious leaders had the Holy One arrested. They had God arrested and put him on trial. Our priests and elders were accusing God of blasphemy. God was on trial for disrespecting God. And if Jesus were found guilty, our religious leaders would put God to death. But they could not find any evidence of blasphemy. They tried. Believe me, they tried. They called all kinds of people to testify against Jesus that morning, but there was no proof. Even when the witnesses lied, they could not find no proof that Jesus had done anything wrong. So Caiaphas stood up and began to interrogate the Lord. You've heard the testimony against you. What do you have to say for yourself? Jesus didn't say one word. Caiaphas tried once more. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of the Blessed One? My heart stood still. I couldn't even breathe. But my mind was screaming, don't say it. Don't say it. But he did. Jesus spoke the words that sealed his fate. I am, he said. I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. I could not believe what I was hearing. Jesus knew what was happening. He knew the council was just looking for a reason to kill him, and he knew there was no reason. He had done nothing wrong. He certainly had not disrespected God. and he'd heard the testimony. Jesus knew the Sanhedrin had not been able to find two people who could tell a story of any wrongdoing that he had supposedly committed. Even when they lied, they could not agree. And according to our laws, two people had to agree in their testimony in order to convict. There was no agreement here. If the Sanhedrin followed the rules, and Lord knows that doesn't always happen, but if they followed the rules, they'd have to set Jesus free. All Jesus had to do was stay silent. That's it. All Jesus had to do was keep his mouth shut. He didn't have to lie. He didn't have to defend himself. He didn't have to call witnesses. All he had to do was stay silent. And he didn't do it. He could not do it. He could not stay silent. He had to speak the truth. Are you the Messiah? I am. I am. And you will see. I closed my eyes in horror and shook my head in disbelief. Jesus had just provided the Sanhedrin with all the proof they needed to convict. The words he spoke were blasphemous to any Jew and traitorous to the Romans. Anyone who knew the Hebrew Scriptures recognized the words that Jesus spoke that day. I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. When Caiaphas asked, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus did not say, I am he, or I am the Blessed One. He didn't even say, I am the Messiah. Instead, he said, I am. And that was the name God had given Moses 1,200 years ago when Moses saw a burning bush and heard the voice of God. When Moses had asked, "What is your name, so I can tell my people who has sent me?" God had answered, I am who I am. Yahweh. And Jesus had dared to speak that name. The very personal name of God. At that, Caiaphas tore his clothes and said, "We don't need any witnesses. We are the witnesses." I mean, you heard what Jesus just said. He declared himself our God. Jesus also quoted Daniel, who had seen the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven, and God the Father will one day grant the Son dominion, authority, and power over all people. His will shall be done, and on that day, all nations and all people will worship him, Jesus, the Son. It's no wonder that Caiaphas was incensed. We Jews worship no one but God. But Jesus really put Caiaphas in his place when he said that the high priest would see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power, referring to one of David's songs in which the Lord promises, "I will make your enemies your footstool." The high priest and the rest of the council didn't like that at all. They declared Jesus guilty of blasphemy, and condemned him to death. Some of them even began to spit on Jesus. They put a blindfold on him and made fun of him, saying, "Prophesy." Then they handed Jesus over to the guards, and they beat him too. And put him back down in the pit to await his awful fate. Peter was shocked. He could not believe what he had seen and heard. It didn't seem real. He stood near the fire in the courtyard, trying to absorb what had just happened. During the trial, no one had paid any attention to Peter, but now that the excitement had died down a little, a servant girl noticed the stranger hiding in the crowd. "I know you," she said. "You were with Jesus, the man from Nazareth." But Peter denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said as he made his way to the outer yard. And a rooster crowed. The girl followed him, and she told the people standing around, "This man is one of them. He was with Jesus." And again, Peter denied it. But now a crowd had started to form, and they paid more attention. "You must be one of Jesus' followers, and you're here from Galilee." At that point, Peter panicked. He began calling curses from heaven down upon himself, swearing, "I do not know this man you are talking about." At that moment, the rooster crowed again. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said just a few hours ago. "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter broke down and wept. Jesus had been so brave. He had stood before the most powerful men in the community, and he had proudly proclaimed the truth. "I am who I am." He had not denied God the Father. He had not turned his back on the Lord. He had not cowered in silence as Caiaphas and the rest of the council decided his fate. Jesus stood and resisted evil once more. Peter had failed him. He had tried, but he failed to stand against the evil one. And though they did not know it, the so-called righteous ones, the Sanhedrin, our priests and elders, they had failed Jesus too. They who had dedicated their lives to the Lord had failed to do what was right. Jesus was the only innocent person in court that day. But he would pay the price for our transgression. He would pay the price for our lack of faith. He would pay the price